For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that debate under Clause 1C of Rule 15 on a motion to suspend the rules relating to H.R. 7573 be extended for 1 hour.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 7573 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 7573, a bill to direct the architect of the Capitol to replace the bust of Roger Brooke Taney in the old Supreme Court chamber of the United States Capitol with a bust of Thurgood Marshall to be obtained by the Joint Committee on the Library and to remove certain statues from areas of the United States Capitol which are accessible to the public, to remove all statues of individuals who voluntarily served in the Confederate States of America from display in the United States Capitol and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the order of the House today, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Butterfield, and a gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, each will be recognized for 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the measure under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I bring this legislation to the floor today on behalf of the Committee on House Administration. I want to thank our chair, Congresswoman Zola Offren, for her leadership. I thank Ranking Member Rodney Davis for his friendship and leadership on our committee. Thank you, Mr. Davis. I said this to you privately. Thank you for the spirit in which you have approached this important but delicate issue. Recognizing the issue of removing Confederate statues from the Capitol has been simmering for years. Since I recognize that, I will now approach the issue today with the utmost respect for those who are opposed to the goal of the legislation. But I ask the dissenters to consider that America has been a divided nation since its founding, and it's past time for us to close this chapter of American history by removing statues that depict an era that caused enormous pain to African American citizens. Mr. Speaker, as you, I grew up in the rural, segregated South, a commonplace where Confederate flags and monuments on public property honoring Confederate soldiers and the Confederacy. Many Southern jurisdictions are now voluntarily removing these statues. President Abraham Lincoln won the 1860 general election by winning 18 of 29 states. The 11 states that Lincoln failed to carry were slave-holding states. These states were fearful that Lincoln would find a way to end slavery and deprive slave owners of their so-called property. 11 Southern states, after Lincoln was elected, 11 immediately seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. The CSA elected its leadership, they printed a currency, and stood up a military. At Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, the Confederate States of America took military action against the United States of America. For the following 4 years, more than 600,000 Americans lost their lives on the battlefield, and I might say including African American soldiers who fought for the Union. This was not a war between the states. It was a war against the United States of America by 11 Southern states. When the Union finally won the war and both sides buried their dead, 4 million slaves were granted their freedom by the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation and passage of the 13th Amendment. In 1864, each state was granted the privilege to donate 2 statues of deceased persons to be displayed in the Capitol that depict the history of their state. These statues are now known as the National Statuary Hall Collection. Approximately 10 of these statues depict men who volunteered to fight against the United States in the Civil War. All of these statues were donated many decades after the Civil War. Like many other statues around the country honoring members of the CSA, and particularly those erected in the South, These 10 statues were not donated and installed in the Capitol until the 1900s, during the height of Jim Crow. Many Americans see these statues and the timing of their placement as a means to intimidate African Americans and to perpetuate the notion of white supremacy. We must not continue to honor these combatants by allowing their images to be on display in the Capitol. The bill before us today also identifies several other statues for removal or replacement that are not part of the National Statuary Hall collection, including the bust of Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, who authored the 1857 Supreme Court decision of Dred Scott versus Sanford that ruled that slaves could not be considered citizens and that Congress did not have the ability to ban slavery. This opinion, Mr. Speaker, is regarded as possibly the Supreme Court's worst decision of all time, and the 7-2 decision was a major factor contributing to the war. Another bust, not part of the collection, is for Vice President John Breckinridge, 1857 to 1861. In 1860, Mr. Speaker, Breckinridge ran for president on the Southern Democratic ticket, and he lost. During the Civil War, Breckinridge served in the United States Senate from Kentucky, but became a traitor and enlisted in the Confederate military, and he was assigned to the Army of Mississippi, stationed in Jackson, Mississippi, achieving the rank of Major General. He was expelled from the Senate. Jefferson Davis then appointed him as Secretary of War. After the war, he fled the country for several years. And so I ask my colleagues, I ask America, does this bust deserve to stand outside of the Senate chamber? I would hope that your answer to that question will be no. I ask my colleagues to answer the summons of our time by voting to remove all of these offensive statues from the Capitol of the United States of America. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time and yield now, if it's appropriate, to the Speaker of the House, the Honorable Nancy Pelosi.
Gentleman reserved.
Yes. Is it appropriate, Mr. Speaker, to now yield to the Speaker?
Yes.
Out of turn. I yield to the Speaker of the House.
Speak.
I thank the gentleman for yielding and for his leadership in bringing us together today, along with our distinguished leader, Mr. Hoyer, our distinguished whip, Mr. Jim Clyburn, CBC Congressional Black Caucus Chair Karen Bass, Chairman Benny Thompson, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, and you, Mr. Butterfield. Thank you for leading this critical effort, so important. Mr. Speaker, as our country knows, nearly 2 months after the murder of George Floyd, America remains gripped by anguish as racial injustice continues to kill hundreds of Black Americans and tear apart the soul of our country. Last month, inspired by the activism of the American people and led by the Congressional Black Caucus, the House passed the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act to fundamentally transform the culture of policing to address systemic racism and curb police brutality, deliver accountability, and save lives. On Juneteenth, I had the privilege as Speaker of the House, by my authority as Speaker of the House, to remove 4 paintings of speakers of the House who are in the Speaker's lobby, Speaker's gallery there, to remove them because they were part of the Confederacy. 3 of them before they came to the Congress, and 1 of them came after his participation in the Confederacy. It was long overdue. When we were checking out the statues, we found out about the paintings, and on Juneteenth we said goodbye to those 4. Now in Congress and in the country, we must maintain a drumbeat to ensure that this moment of anguish continues to be transformed into action. That is why today the House is proud to pass legislation to remove from the U.S. Capitol the 12 statues of Confederate officials and 4 other statues honoring persons who similarly exemplify bigotry and hate. Again, thanks to Leader Hoyer, Whip Clyburn, CBC Chair Karen Bass, Mr. Chairman Benny Thompson, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, and Chairman G.K. Butterfield. I thank them for leading this effort. As I have said before, the halls of Congress are the very heart of our democracy. The statues in the Capitol should embody our highest ideals. as Americans, expressing who we are and what we aspire to as a nation. Monuments to men who advocated barbarism and racism are a grotesque affront to those ideals. Their statues pay homage to hate, not heritage. Among the Confederate statues in the Capitol, can you believe this, are Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens, President and Vice President, respectively, of the Confederacy. Both of them were charged with treason against America, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman. Both were charged with treason against America, and they have statues in the Capitol. And now think of this about Stephens. I hate to even use his words, but it may be important for people to know why these statues have to go in clearer terms. The infamous words of Stephens make as clear today as they did in 1861 the aims of the Confederacy. In his so-called cornerstone speech, Stephens asserted that the prevailing idea relied upon by the framers included the assumption of the equality of races. This was in error, says Mr. Stephens. Instead, he laid out in blunt and simple terms the awful truth of the Confederacy. He said, our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Imagine, exactly the opposite of idea of equality of races. Its foundations are laid in its cornerstone, rests upon the great truth. And these are his words. I hate to even use them, but we have to face this reality. The Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. He's got a statue in the Capitol of the United States. How can we seek to end the scourge of racism in America when we allow the worst perpetrators of that racism to be lauded in the halls of Congress? This bill also removes the statue of John Calhoun, the unapologetic leader of the Senate's pro-slavery faction, who on the Senate floor celebrated slavery as a positive good. Mr. Clyburn, I know you support removing your South Carolinian, huh? And on the floor, he made this vile, John C. Calhoun made this vile assertion that, quote, in few countries is so much left to the share of the laborer, and so little exacted from him or more kind attention paid to him in sickness or infirmities of age. What could he have been talking about? And it removes from the old Supreme Court chamber the bust of Justice Roger Taney. And this is the persistent leadership of Mr. Hoyer, who has been on this case for a long time. Justice Taney was the author of the Dred Scott ruling, which Mr. Butterfield very clearly laid out as probably one of the worst decisions of the Supreme Court ever, but certainly an horrific stain on the history of our country and certainly on the court. How fitting it is that the Taney bust will be replaced with a bust of U.S. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, a towering champion of equality and justice in America. Mr. Clyburn, as well as Mr. Hoyer, have been working on this, and Mr. Hoyer is a Marylander. I'm a Baltimorean. As you know, the airport in Baltimore is named for Thurgood Marshall. So as one who was born and raised there, I take pride in his leadership and service to the country. Let us recall Justice Marshall's words spoken nearly 30 years ago, but as true today. Justice Marshall said, democracy cannot flourish amid fear. Liberty cannot bloom amid hate. Justice cannot take root amidst rage. America must get to work. In the chill climate in which we live, we must go against the prevailing wind. This is further. We must dissent from the indifference. We must dissent from the apathy. We must dissent from the fear, the hatred, and the mistrust. We must dissent because America can do better, because America has no choice but to do better. how much our great Elijah Cummings reflected the words of Thurgood Marshall, two Baltimoreans. The Congress now has the sacred opportunity and obligation to do better, to make meaningful change to ensure that the halls of the U.S. Capitol reflect the highest ideals as Americans. Mr. Hoyer, as our distinguished floor leader, had this planned for a while that you all would work together and bring this composite bill to the floor at this time. Little did we know when those plans were being made that at the same time we would be mourning the loss of our darling John Lewis. It's a death in the family for us in the Congress. But he knew that this was in the works, and he's up there looking down on us to make sure it happens in the most bipartisan way. I urge a strong bipartisan vote for the important step for justice, reconciliation, and progress in America. And as far as our John Lewis is concerned, thank you. Thank you for bringing us to this place. May you rest in peace. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman,
I continue to reserve.
Reserve.
I continue to reserve.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And at this time, it looks like I'm going to be here on the floor with many of our colleagues that are going to offer remarks on this legislation. So I will give my opening remarks after I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First and foremost, the Confederacy was a fundamental attack on our Constitution and the founding principles of our nation, and it should never be romanticized or honored. I've got no problems with removing lawfully any monument that specifically honors this rebellion. But that's not what this bill does. Rather, it begins by removing the bust of Roger Taney from the old Supreme Court chamber. Now, it is true, he wrote the absolutely worst decision ever rendered by the Supreme Court, the Dred Scott decision. But let's not forget, he also presided over and joined in one of its better decisions, the Amistad slave case. If we remove memorials to every person in this building who ever made a bad decision, and his was the worst, well, this would be a very barren place indeed. It's only the bad things in our history that we can use to measure all of the good things in our history. Now, this bill also removes the statues of Confederate sympathizers sent to the Capitol by the states. Well, that's not our decision. That is a decision that has always belonged to the individual states, and several of them are already making these decisions. We should let them. The only other is John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, who is honored not for his service to the Confederacy, but rather for his service as Vice President of the United States. And granted, we have had some absolutely terrible vice presidents through our history, and I'm sure we will in the future. But if we're going to start down that road, we're going to be swapping out statues like trading cards at the whim of the moment. Our nation's history should be made of sterner stuff. Perhaps we would all be better advised to practice a little temporal humility and heed the wisdom of Omar Khayyam. The moving finger writes, and having writ moves on. Nor all thy piety nor wit can call it back to cancel half a line, nor all thy tears wash out a word of it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my privilege to yield time now to the Democratic whip, the gentleman representing the 6th Congressional District of South Carolina, the state where the Civil War began, Mr. Clyburn, who is a national expert on American history, having been a former history classroom teacher, as I recall. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina.
I thank the Speaker for yielding me the time, and I thank my friend from North Carolina for his leadership and his management of this significant piece of legislation. I want to thank Mr. Davis and the other members on the other side for their tremendous cooperation in trying to help us move to a more perfect union. Mr. Speaker, several years ago, I stood on this floor and I referred to this chamber, this great hall, as America's classroom. And it's in that spirit that I think of this building as America's schoolhouse. And what is taught in this building, what is experienced by the people who visit this building, ought to be about the uplifting of this great nation. And what people see when they come here, who people see lauded, glorified, and honored when they visit this building, ought to be people who are uplifting to history and the human spirit. It is in that light that I recall the writings of one great writer who wrote that if we fail to learn the lessons of history, I think it was George Santayana, we are bound to repeat them. There are a lot of lessons to be learned from history. I study it every day. Hardly a day goes by without I don't spend some time looking at some facet of American history. We do not come to this floor with this legislation to get rid of that history. A lot of it we don't like. A lot of it we do like. And I think that what we need to do is discern between what should be honored and what should be relegated to the museums and to other places to commemorate that history. That's not eradicating history. That is putting history in its proper place. And for those who did not do what I think they should have done, they've got a place in the history books, but it's not to be honored, and it's not to be glorified. It ought to be put in its proper perspective. So I don't have a problem with the fact that one of the statues in here, John C. Calhoun, he was a historical figure. Died in 1850, if my memory serves, 10 years before the war broke out. So we aren't talking about John C. Calhoun as a Confederate. We're talking about John C. Calhoun as one of the nation's biggest proponents of slavery and the relegation of human beings. And I want to thank my home state of South Carolina, because the people of Charleston, Mayor Tecklenburg and the City Council in Charleston decided several weeks ago that John C. Calhoun's statue should be taken down. And they did it. Clemson University, Calhoun, one of the great founders of that university. It's one of the original land-grant schools. Clemson University decided that they would take John C. Calhoun's name off of their honors college. So if the state of South Carolina, where he was from, sees that, why is it that we are going to laud him in this building? I'm asking my colleagues to do for John C. Calhoun what his home state is doing for him, putting him in his proper place, not a place of honor. They didn't tear down his statue. They very meticulously took it down to retire to his proper place. Mr. Speaker, you and I spoke last night about one of the other gentlemen whose statue is in this building, Wade Hampton. Wade Hampton. He was not a Confederate, but he was a perseverer. There were three Wade Hamptons, senior and the third.
The gentleman's time has expired. You yield additional minute to the gentleman.
I will yield an additional minute to the gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you very much.
The gentleman is recognized.
But Wade Hampton's history should not be glorified. I don't know what my state's going to do about him, but what I would like to see us do here is put him in his proper place. So those two statues that are here representing the state of South Carolina need to be removed from their places of honor, and at some point I would hope the state will bring them back home and put them in their proper place. And so I'd like to say here today that I'm not for destroying any statue. I'm not here for burning down any building. I'm here to ask my colleagues to very properly and lawfully return these people to their proper place. Put them where they can be studied. Put them where people will know exactly who and what they were. But do not honor them. Do not glorify them. Take them out of this great schoolhouse so that the people who visit here can be uplifted by what this country is all about. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from North Carolina, reserved.
I reserve,
Gentleman
Mr. Speaker.
from Illinois.
Mr. Speaker, it's an honor to follow Whip Clyburn and the historical context of being a history teacher, and also the historical context of serving in this institution and what it means. So thank you, Whip Clyburn. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you to my good friend, Mr. Butterfield, for your leadership on this issue. We're going to work together today to make sure that we send a message to the American people that it's Republicans and Democrats standing together. Now, I have a unique district in central Illinois. I'm from the land of Lincoln. As a matter of fact, Abe himself lives in my district. I represent Lincoln's tomb, Lincoln's home, the old state capitol where Abraham Lincoln delivered his House divided speech in 1858 is in my congressional district. It was there where Lincoln not only spoke out against slavery and specifically the Dred Scott decision, but stood unequivocally in support of a free country, famously saying, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other." While Lincoln and many others who stood for freedom are represented throughout this Capitol, there are others that symbolize the opposite. While we cannot erase our past and should do everything we can, as Whip Clyburn just stated, we should do everything we can to learn from it instead. The statues in the U.S. Capitol represent to visitors throughout the world what we stand for as a nation. I support this important discussion about which statues belong in the U.S. Capitol and also the goal of this legislation. Before we began debating this piece of legislation, my friend Mr. Butterfield and I had a discussion about the 13th Amendment. And I invite all members of this institution to come to my district, to come to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Museum and Library, where I can show you an original copy of the 13th Amendment. Also, one of the first copies of the Emancipation Proclamation. This institution is not just an extended classroom. Where Lincoln lived, where Lincoln is honored, the 13th District of Illinois, that I am truly blessed to represent, is also a living classroom of the good things in our nation's history. Now, we also have to remember that the National Statuary Hall Collection was created in 1864 to commemorate states and their contributions to this country. And many statues being discussed today were donated by states to the collection nearly 100 years ago. And as my colleagues earlier have said, many states are already working to remove them. And while I support their removal, I believe the better route would have been to have some more hearings in the Committee on House Administration. But today is not about politics. Today is about coming together as an institution. And today is a day that I can say I proudly am blessed to be a member of Congress. And our country right now is facing a very difficult time. And Abraham Lincoln's spirit of unity is desperately needed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. As leaders, we need to come together to show there is much more that unites us as Americans than divides us, and lead this country together, Republicans and Democrats, through this difficult time. And I hope this legislation today, the bipartisanship that we'll see, is a shining example to the rest of the country that we can do it together. And I will reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and let me thank the gentleman from Illinois. I am just delighted that you mentioned that your home state, the state of Illinois, was in fact the home of Abraham Lincoln. I am a student of history and love to read that portion of our history, and I recall that many people believe that it was the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st of 1863 that legally ended slavery in America. The Emancipation Proclamation, as great as it was an executive order. It was the 13th Amendment, as you mentioned, that legally ended slavery in America, thereby freeing 4 million slaves, most of whom lived in the South. And you should know, Mr. Speaker, and to my friend from Illinois, that it was on January 31st, 1865, a few days after Lincoln's re-election, that this body, the House of Representatives, passed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. It required the ratification of 27 states. And your home state, Mr. Davis, was the first state on February 1st, 1865, to ratify the 13th Amendment. My state of North Carolina was the 26th state, and the state of Georgia was the final state to ratify the 13th Amendment on December 6, 1865. At this time, Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted to yield time to the majority leader of this House, the gentleman from the state of Maryland, which is the home of both Chief Justice Taney and the Associate Justice, the first African-American Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, the Honorable Thurgood Marshall. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Maryland.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman from North Carolina, the former Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court, for yielding. I'm glad that I was on the floor to hear the remarks of the ranking member, Mr. Davis. I'm going to bring up a quote. I won't get it soon enough to read right now, but I'll read it. David Brooks wrote a column in the New York Times. And he said we were facing 5 crises in America. One, of course, the pandemic. And then he said the second crisis was the crisis of confronting racism and the history of racism and slavery and segregation in our country. And the observation he made was that Americans post George Floyd had been riveted on the recognition of our past and the recognition of our present and how we need to improve the treatment and the reality of equality in America. I think Brooks's observation will be proved today on the floor, Mr. Davis, as we come together, not in partisan disagreement, but in a unity of purpose, recognizing that our conscience and the conscience of America has been pricked by also the event of the loss of John Lewis, who all his life fought for equality. Mr. Speaker, the Capitol building is a sacred space for our American democracy. It is where we write our laws, inaugurate our presidents, and say a somber farewell to great Americans who earned our respect, like Dwight Eisenhower, other presidents, Rosa Parks. Mr. Speaker, we cannot erase the difficult history and painful truth that this temple to liberty was built using the labor of enslaved people. But we can, Mr. Speaker, do everything in our power to ensure that how we use the Capitol today reflects our commitment to equality and justice for all. For too long, we have greeted visitors from here and abroad with the statutes of those who denigrated these values by championing sedition, slavery, segregation, and inequality. As a Marylander, I have always been uncomfortable that the old Supreme Court chamber prominently displays a bust of former Chief Justice Roger Brooke Taney, who was from the district, as a matter of fact, the county across the river from my house, Calvert County. Taney, of course, was the son of slaveholders and the author of the 1857 Dred Scott ruling that upheld slavery and said African Americans could not be citizens. This was a man, Mr. Speaker, in his zeal to protect the interests of slaveholders and uphold a system of white supremacy, wrote an opinion that twisted the very meaning of America's founding. After quoting the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Taney wrote this: the general words above quoted would seem to embrace the whole human family. And if they were used in a similar instrument at this day, meaning 1857, would be so understood. But he went on to say the enslaved African American race were not intended to be included and formed no part of the people who framed and adopted this declaration. Of course, neither did women. In short, Mr. Speaker, Taney argued that in his day, in 1857, people of African American descent had come to be seen as human beings. But because our founders in 1776 did not view them as such, black people could never truly be citizens of the United States. What he was saying, Mr. Speaker, that black lives did not matter. And so, Mr. Speaker, when we hear that phrase today, that black lives matter, it is fundamental to what America is and has become. And sadly, Roger Brooke Taney, respected in his time, the Attorney General of my state, the Attorney General of the United States, the acting Secretary of Treasury, could not extricate himself from the false premises of the past. And Abraham Lincoln was, as Mr. Davis pointed out, outraged at the decision he wrote. Arguably, as my friend, the Justice, said earlier today, arguably the worst case in the history of the Supreme Court of the United States. In short, Taney argued people of African descent had come to be seen as human beings, but because our founders did not view them as such, black people could never truly be citizens of our country. Think of that. The blindness and schizophrenia of 1987 repeated 80 years later in 1857. One of the great facets of America is we can grow, we can change, we can accommodate to better knowledge, better insight, better inclinations. The past, Tawney argued, bound those in the present to follow the errors of their forebears in perpetuity. Let us reject that premise out of hand, lest the more perfect union will never be attainable. What he could not or would not accept is that the passage of times allows us the space to grow as individuals, as states, and as a country, so that we may see our faults and correct them, not repeat them. In Maryland, we have grappled with that difficult history of our state with regard to slavery and the Civil War. While our state did not secede from the Union, many Marylanders sympathized with slavery in the South and fought for the Confederacy. Mr. Speaker, I represent what was the largest slave-holding area of the state of Maryland. We grew tobacco, some cotton, but mainly tobacco. Early Maryland was built on the profits of slavery, and it sent individuals like Tawney to serve in America's early institutions. Indeed, in his infamous opinion, Tawney drew on his home state's ban on interracial marriage as justification for his views. One of the ironies, Mr. Speaker, is I was elected to the Maryland State Senate in 1966. And one of my first votes in January of 1967 as a Maryland State Senator at the age of 27 was to vote to repeal the miscegenation statutes in my state. Of course, the Supreme Court had ruled on it before that, but we still had not repealed it. 110 years after Dred Scott, Maryland today, like other states where slavery and segregation had a long history, is not the same place that it was when Tawney wrote his opinion. Nor are the states today the same places they were when many of the statues and busts of Confederates and segregationists were sent here to our capital during a period of intense and racially charged sectionalism. In recent years, Maryland made the courageous and correct choice to remove a statue of Tawney from the grounds of the State House in Annapolis. I strongly supported that decision, as did our Republican governor, Mr. Hogan, and our Democratic legislature. Removing a statute, as my dear friend of over half a century, Mr. Clyburn, observed on this floor, does not erase history. That act by itself will not make right what was so terribly wrong in the past. But the statutes we choose to set in place of honor are a reflection of the present, not the past. They show our fellow Americans and foreign visitors what our values are today. And our decision to remove statutes of seditionists, white supremacists, Confederates, and segregationists, and replace them with defenders of justice and equality, shows that as a country, we are capable of critical introspection and growth. That is our strength. That is the glory of America, working towards a more perfect union. That's why I introduced this bill along with Representative Lee, Whip Clyburn, Chairwoman Bass, Chairman Thompson, who sits in the chair today. That itself is a historic demonstration of the change that we have wrought. Not only could a black man from Mississippi be a member of the Congress, but he could preside over the Congress. He matters. His life matters. And Tawney was wrong. Because in the 21st century, we must not be Roger Brooke Tawney's America anymore. Nor can we be Jim Crow's. Our bill removes the bust of Chief Justice Tawney from the old Supreme Court chamber and replaces it with a bust of Thurgood Marshall a son of Baltimore. And the irony is, the Tawney statue was on the east front of the Capitol, Mr. Speaker. If you turned around and you went through the Capitol 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years, if you went through about 500 feet and walked out on the west front, you walked into Thurgood Marshall Park, as you would today. He was our first African American justice. How appropriate is that we honor him in place of Roger Brooke Tawney. Thurgood Marshall is the face of our Maryland in 2020, not Roger Tawney. Second, our bill no longer allows states to display statutes in the Capitol of individuals who voluntarily served the Confederacy against our Union during the Civil War. Let me just say as an aside, none of us are perfect. Our founders weren't perfect. But what our founders did was create a union. The statutes we are removing tried to destroy a union. And third, there are 3 specific statutes in the collection of individuals who did not serve in the Confederacy, but whose careers were built on the perpetuation of white supremacy and segregation. Our bill would require those statutes to be removed and replaced as well. And as my friend Jim Clyburn said, not destroyed. We urge nobody to tear down statutes. To remove them, yes. To destroy them, no. They do not reflect the diversity and inclusivity of our nation today, nor do they comport with our values as a nation that has reached a greater understanding of the principles enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. That all are created equal, and humankind, Tawney admitted in 1857, would have been the understanding of that phrase. There are still, sadly, a lot of people in our country in 2020 who do not understand that our diversity is our strength, or recognize clearly that black lives matter. Tawney forcefully argued they did not. He was willfully wrong. They do. They must. I believe that most Americans are deeply distressed by racial injustice and want to see the progress of the civil rights movement continue. They want our nation and our democracy to grow, mature, and become more perfect. Part of that process is making it clear, through our symbols and public displays of honor, what our country stands for and, as importantly, what it must never stand for again. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join us, not as an expression of partisan opinion, but an expression of America's values. To our citizens and to the world, we do not glorify racism and bigotry and exclusion in the temple to liberty and in the land of the free. And I hope our colleagues will join in making possible and making sure that all Americans, no matter their race, can come to this Capitol and know that they have an equal share in a government that is truly of the people, by the people, and for the people. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from North Carolina reserves. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois.
I'd like to offer 2 minutes to my good friend from the state of Michigan, Representative Mitchell.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Ranking Member Davis. I wasn't planning to speak on this. It's an honor to speak after Mr. Hoyer. I heard Mr. Clyburn speak eloquently regarding the removal of statues including that of the former Chief Justice Tawney. A statue honoring him, for we all agree, was the most dreadful decision the Supreme Court has ever made in the history of this country. Not based upon the law, but based upon his feelings that African Americans weren't people. I'm speaking today not so much that it convinces anybody in this chamber, but I'm speaking about history, and I'm speaking about my children and my grandchildren, that they need to remember the history of this nation. The history of this nation that is so fraught with racial division, with hatred. And the only way to overcome that is to recognize that, acknowledge it for what it is. So I support this resolution, and I support what Mr. Clyburn said, to remove statues such as that Mr. Tawney, to lawfully remove them, not tear them down, not destroy them, return them back to the states and places from which they came, and to study, to put them in the study of the history of this nation, because it should not be lost. Tearing it down does not do justice to the history of this nation and what our young people must understand, Mr. Speaker, that you've gone through in your life, Mr. Lewis did and others. We can't simply ignore it and say because we tore down statues or we burned things, it's suddenly gone. No, we need to recognize those things as part of our history in order to move on beyond them, because as many have said, to not acknowledge, to recognize, to understand our history runs a very real risk of reliving it, and my God, we can't continue to do that. Support the resolution. I support the removal of statues. I yield back my time. Thank you, sir.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman yield reserves. Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina.
I'm pleased to yield to the gentlelady from the 13th District of California, a passionate advocate for underserved communities, the Honorable Barbara Lee, 1.5 minutes.
Gentlelady from California is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Let me first thank the gentleman for yielding and for your tremendous leadership and constantly reminding us of the accurate accounting of the United States history. Also, let me just thank our Speaker, our Majority Leader, our Whip, Mr. Clyburn, Chairwoman Bass, Chairman Benny Thompson, and of course Congressman Butterfield for moving this legislation forward with the urgency that it requires. I rise in strong support of H.R. 7573, which will remove shameful reminders of slavery and segregation from the United States Capitol. Now, in 2017, in the wake of the white nationalist rally in Charlottesville, I introduced the Confederate Monument Removal Act to remove all statues of people who voluntarily served the Confederacy from the Capitol building. So thank you for including this in this current bill. Venerating those who took up arms against the United States to preserve slavery is an affront to the human dignity of all Americans. These painful symbols of bigotry and racism have no place in public spaces. Certainly, they should not be enshrined in the United States Capitol. It's past time for Congress to stop glorifying the men who were traitors and committed treason against the United States in a concerted effort to keep African Americans in chains. The movement to honor Confederate soldiers was a deliberate act to rewrite the very history of the United States and humanize acts designed to dehumanize African Americans. They are symbols of hatred and defiance of federal authority and should not be held in a place of honor in the United States Capitol. In this moment, the horrors of systemic racism are front and center.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
30 additional seconds, Mr. Speaker.
Gentlelady's recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
Let me just conclude by saying this. In this moment, the horrors of systemic racism are front and center, and the manifestations are before the public each and every day. The removal of Confederate statues from the United States Capitol, is an important step in dismantling the systems that hold us back. As a descendant of enslaved Americans from Galveston, Texas, enslaved human beings, I thank you for this bill, and I ask for an aye vote.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from
Reserved.
Carolina reserves. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois.
At this point in time, Mr. Speaker, I'll reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina.
May I inquire, Mr. Speaker, how much time each side has?
Gentleman from North Carolina has 13.5 minutes. Gentleman from Illinois has 21 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, at this time it's my pleasure to yield time to a member of the House Committee on Administration, a great constitutional scholar from the state of Maryland, my friend, Mr. Raskin, Jamie Raskin. 2 minutes.
Gentleman from Maryland recognized for 2 minutes.
Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Butterfield, for your really exemplary leadership here. It's a proud day for Maryland as we replace the bust of Roger Brooke Taney, or we move to replace the bust of Roger Brooke Taney with the bust of Thurgood Marshall. One Marylander wrote the infamous Dred Scott decision, hundreds of pages of argumentation about how the Constitution is and must forever be a white man's compact, and that African Americans have no rights that white people have to respect. And the other, Thurgood Marshall, whose bust will replace that of Justice Taney, argued Brown versus Board of Education, argued Shelley versus Kramer, argued Smith versus Allwright, became the first African American Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. He made equal protection come alive in our country. So it's a proud day for Maryland. I was delighted to hear the gentleman from Illinois' remarks, but I was amazed to hear another colleague in the minority defending the bust of John C. Breckinridge on the grounds that we don't honor him for his service as Secretary of War in the Confederacy, but we rather honor him for what he did before that in his prior service as a United States Senator and Vice President of the United States. Well, that's just precious. Think about that for a second. Breckinridge was serving as a U.S. Senator from Kentucky when he defected to the Union, signed up to become their Secretary of War, and betrayed the Union, and they still have his bust outside of the United States Senate saying Vice President on it, despite the fact that on December 4th, 1861, he was convicted of treason by the Senate and stripped of all of his titles, including Senator, President of the Senate, and Vice President. So we may as well put up a statue of Benedict Arnold to honor him for his service to the Continental Army before he defected over to the British side and led British troops against America. So let's go all the way here. If there are statues of traitors and racist, white supremacist supporters of the Confederacy up in the Capitol, then we need to get rid of them. This is our opportunity to remake the social contract as represented by the symbolism in this great house. I yield back.
Expired. Gentleman from North Carolina, reserved.
Reserve.
Chair recognizes gentleman from
Reserve.
Illinois, reserved. Chair recognizes gentleman from North Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted to yield time to the gentleman from Massachusetts. I would say that before he speaks, that the history that I've read over the years suggests to me that on January 31st, 1865, when the 13th Amendment was passed by this body, this chamber, Mr. Kennedy, the gallery was full of white abolitionist women from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts who waved handkerchiefs and cheered for a prolonged period of time, cheering the 13th Amendment. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Kennedy.
Gentleman from Massachusetts recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Speaker, 155 years ago, senators from my home state of Massachusetts, Charles Sumner and Henry Wilson, knew that a bust of Roger Taney deserved no home in our government's highest institutions. Yet here we are, in 2020, and the bust of a man who tried to codify and protect our original sin remains only a few hundred feet away. Statues honoring traitors, willing to destroy our nation so that they could own black men, women, and children, litter our capital. And somehow, we still need to have this debate. Let me be clear. Dismantling the symbols that glorify white supremacy is a bare minimum. But dismantling those symbols is no substitute for dismantling the system that those men created. This cannot be the end or the best of what we can offer the millions who took to our streets demanding justice. This cannot be the end of our work. This shouldn't even be considered the beginning of that work. It should have been done 150 years ago. The Senate needs to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. We need to dismantle and destroy white supremacy that exists everywhere, from our education system to our healthcare system to our incarceration and juvenile justice systems and our financial institutions and our economy. That's where we need to be working. And that's what begins. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from North Carolina reserves.
I reserve.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois.
I'll reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman reserves. Chair recognizes gentleman from North Carolina. Gentleman.
Gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Butterfield.
Mr. Speaker, at this time it is my pleasure to yield time to the gentleman from Mississippi, the chairman of the Committee on Homeland Security, a great warrior of many years, Mr. Benny Thompson.
Gentleman from Mississippi.
I yield Mr. Thompson 2 minutes at this time.
Thank you very much.
The gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the gentleman from North Carolina giving me an opportunity to speak. For those of us who are sons of the South, those of us who have endured hardship, discrimination, and a lot of things that is very difficult to even talk about, for this moment in time where we are today, where we are going to start the process of healing and setting the record straight as it relates to the real history of this country. It is fitting and proper that those individuals who fought to keep many of our ancestors enslaved should not have to be recognized in a place where people who do good expect to be recognized. This is not a way of erasing history. It is a way of correcting history so that those people who come and see it will see it in the manner for which it's presented. So at the end of this debate, I hope we all will be on the same page. This notion that in America, it is not your color, it is not your race, it's not your sex, but we have to stand for something. Our values should mean something as Americans. And so this bill establishes what America stands for. And we should not recognize traitors in order just to say we are together. Traitors have a place, but not in a place of honor. My state recognizes the president of the Confederacy. If he had won the war as president, none of us of color would be in this institution today. But thank God, he lost, and the South lost, and we're better because of it. And for that, I ask support of this legislation. And yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from North Carolina reserves. Is that correct? Chair
I do
recognizes
reserve.
the gentleman from Illinois. Gentleman from Illinois.
Reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina, Ms. Butterfield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at this time I'm delighted to yield time to the gentlelady from the 18th District of Texas, a senior member of the Judiciary Committee, Homeland Security Committee, and the author of H.R. 40, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 1 minute, 30 seconds.
Gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Thank you very much to the manager of this legislation for his leadership. Let me also acknowledge and thank Mr. Hoyer for his as well, and to Mr. Clyburn, Ms. Bass, Mr. Thompson, and as I indicated, Mr. Butterfield. Let me start as I did just a few minutes ago, in God we trust, and recognize that God has created in many of our faith all of us equal as humans. We stand today dealing with the Confederacy that diminished and denied those descendants of African slaves or those African slaves their humanity. And yet, in a place of freedom, this place, we honored them. I welcome H.R. 7573 and glad to be joining as a staunch supporter. For if Justice Taney viewed me as inhuman, then that means that those today, those babies yet unborn from descendants of enslaved Africans, would be inhuman. This is needed not because we don't put it in the historical context, but because we need to unify America. And as we have lost a great warrior, John Lewis, and as well C.T. Vivian, I know they are looking down to say that we are not to honor those who voluntarily served to deny us our humanity and to fight for the Confederacy and were treasonous. Alexander Hamilton Stevens, it's interesting that he secured the name of Alexander Hamilton, has a statue in Statutory Hall. It says, "I am not fearful of anything on earth, I'm not fearful of anything above, except..."
Gentlelady's time has expired.
30 additional seconds, Mr. Speaker.
Gentlelady's recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
"Except to do something wrong." That is what Alexander Hamilton Stevens said. Well, this is wrong. It was wrong to enslave so many human beings and for that slavery to last over 200 years. I am delighted with the gentleman from Illinois for his congenial and historic moment today, and we do it in unity. I offer peace to this nation and to this body that we remove these by bringing America together. I know the family of George Floyd, who struck a chord in the hearts of all Americans, and Black Lives Matter, would welcome this magnificent decision today. Let us do it together under this flag. In God we trust. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentleman from North Carolina reserves. Chair recognizes gentleman from Illinois.
Reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, North Carolina.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'm pleased to yield time to the gentleman from Baltimore, Maryland, my friend Kwasi Mfume, who is not only the representative of a district in Maryland, but also the former national president of the NAACP. I yield 1.5 minutes to Mr. Mfume.
Gentleman is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Yielding and for allowing me to participate in this. Mr. Speaker, 33 years ago, I stood near this spot and watched Thurgood Marshall come through these doors as a member of the Supreme Court at a State of the Union address. And as a Marylander and as a Baltimorean, had a great sense of pride. And I got to know Mr. Marshall, and all he ever said by his eloquence and his example was, this is how we ought to be as Supreme Court justices. I must tell you, I was dismayed, though, years earlier to learn as a young student at Morgan State University the history of Roger B. Taney, who did just the opposite to my spirit and just the opposite, I think, to what we believe Supreme Court justices should act like and conduct themselves. Gentleman from the other side earlier said that Mr. Taney rendered the worst Supreme Court decision ever, and he is exactly right. That decision said, and I quote, that black people had no rights for which the white man was to respect, and therefore that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his own benefit. It also said that black people born in America, like Dred Scott, were not citizens, and it eviscerated the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So replacing the statue of Taney with one instead of Thurgood Marshall seems to me the way we ought to go as a chamber, I hope in a bipartisan fashion, not only for ourselves, but to say to all the visitors that come through this building that we will continue to hold high real American heroes that sought to keep us together, and we will not honor those who sought to divide us. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from North Carolina reserves. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois.
I do reserve. I have no further speakers. Mr. Davis?
I'll close. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much.
Illinois is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to follow our new colleague, Mr. Mfume, because of COVID and the restrictions we have in getting together and getting to know each other like we did before this pandemic. I have not had a chance to meet you yet. Welcome to this institution. Thank you for your service here. Thank you for your service leading the NAACP. I don't know if you're aware, Mr. Mfumi, but many say that the birthplace of the NAACP is also in Springfield, Illinois, because of the 1908 race riots that took place in my district. We're trying to honor those who suffered during that instance in our nation's history. Still, centuries after we saw the scourge of slavery come to our shores. We still have a lot of work to do. But I welcome you, Mr. Mfumi. Come to my district. See the artifacts from those race riots that have been dug up and displayed for all to see, for all to be honored. That's what education and history is. I'll yield to the gentleman.
And I thank you very much. I appreciate your kind and overly gracious remarks. I appreciate also your sense of history and for what I think today is being displayed as a bipartisan effort to draw attention to and to reconcile a very real problem. So I will be more than happy to do that. And Lincoln was one of my heroes in many respects, not just because he signed, as Mr. Butterfield said, an executive order in 1863, but that he reminded us of what we were supposed to be as a nation. Was he flawed? Yes. Are we flawed? Yes. Do we increase our ability to grow together? The absolute answer is yes. So I do appreciate the gentleman's comments, and I appreciate him yielding. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Fumi. I'll reclaim my time. That's exactly why we still, as a nation, have so much to learn about each other. We have so much to learn as to why we live, and we are blessed to live in what I consider the greatest country in the history of God's green earth. The opportunities for every American to do what we do, to serve in this great institution, is something that should be cherished. Those issues that seemingly divide us more in a nation of prosperity, we need to educate the youth. We need to educate America on how we can come together, not just correcting some of the awful and evil parts of our nation's history, but let's continue to correct the division that exists today, not just on this floor, but in this country. And if we can stand together in this instance, we can surely stand together and make this country, at a time and places of civil unrest, a better place for every single American in this country. With that, Mr. Speaker, I thank again all of my colleagues. I respect their opinions, their ideas, but today is a day of history. Today is a day that we're going to band together in a bipartisan way, and I commend my good friend, Mr. Butterfield, and look forward to hosting him in Springfield, Illinois. With that, I yield back and urge support.
The gentleman from Illinois yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm now preparing to close, and I thank all of the speakers for your eloquent words today. Mr. Davis, we have talked a lot about President Abraham Lincoln. There's one thing that I failed to mention and the other speakers failed to mention as well, and that was after the ratification of the 13th Amendment, or before the ratification of the 13th Amendment, Lincoln was actually assassinated on April 14th, as I recall, of 1865, and did not live to see the full ratification of the 13th Amendment, which was the culmination of a lot of his work. And so I just wanted to put that into the record. But, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased with the tone of this debate. I don't even want to call it a debate. I call it a discussion for the last few minutes. I feel the bipartisanship in the air, and I thank you so very much. It's appreciated. History teaches us that there are times in our history when eras must be closed and we must begin a new era of this great nation. We need to continue to strive for a more perfect union, and today is a good example of that. I ask my colleagues to vote yea on this legislation. I ask for a unanimous vote, and hopefully we can do this by voice vote. That is my prayer, and that is my hope. That will show the world that we are united on this issue. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The question is, will the House